I'm just going to introduce myself quickly and give some backstory and a little context to those in the room who don't know me yet or online, who I haven't met. So I apologise to those of you who know me very well and have almost certainly heard all of this before. I've been working full-time in hemp now for the past 4 years, and like others here, I wear a couple of different hats in this exciting emerging industry. Let's see, now we've got the fun, there I am. Okay, so my startup X-Hemp is the only hemp fibre processing factory in Tasmania. With 3 harvests under our belts, we are one of a tiny handful of mills operating reliably in this country at the moment, supplying hurd for the building sector. And to my knowledge, we are the only entirely female-owned and operated facility of this kind in the world. Before I tell you about X-Hemp, and it is quite a tale, I want to share a little bit about the path I've taken to get here, as it's quite different to those described by most of the other speakers. While I do now hold a couple of licenses to grow hemp, I don't come from an ag background, and it is highly unlikely that I'll ever be brave enough to call myself a farmer. I'm not a qualified builder or a materials scientist, and while I have paid a lot of money to my learned legal mates over the years, I'm not a lawyer. In fact, my CV might not make a lot of sense to most of you. After leaving school and managing to have a splendid extended gap year that lasted for a 5-year stint in London, having a very fun time, I then spent several years at the coalface working for a major bank as I put myself through university. I then ran a very large nightclub in the city of Hobart before spending some miserable time serving billionaires on luxury super yachts in the Med. I then had a stint working in TV and film production, working on some good and some not so good reality shows, while also undertaking multiple private property developments in the States. I ended up operating and co-owning a camera accessories business based out of Colorado, and that was a company that I sold in 2018. After returning home to Tassie in late 2019, after that decade spent working in the States, and having made the decision to work in the industrial cannabis sector, I offered my services to our local industry group and ended up working as the executive officer at the Tasmanian Hemp Association for over 3 years. In September last year at our AGM, I put my hand up to serve as the volunteer president, taking the reins from Tim Schmidt after his 6 years at the helm. And I now serve alongside these 8 excellent humans who comprise our elected board. In these past few years, the THA has built our ranks from less than 50 to over 200 fee-paying members. We have several thousand who stay in touch with us via e-news and our social media platforms, and have run multiple community education days every year since 2020. Our association took on the task of project managing the AgriFutures industrial hemp variety trial site at Epping Forest in 2021. And we secured the rights to host the 3rd biennial Australian Industrial Hemp Conference in March of 2022. This was a very successful summit where I was proud to work alongside founder Robert Bell as the event manager, where I met many of you, and perhaps most importantly, where I got to pretend that I was singing in a band with my now very dear friend and passionate hemp advocate, James Blundell. James's clever son, Briar, played the hemp electric guitar and amp that we'd arranged to have my mates at Silver Mountain Hemp in Colorado build for the conference, and which I believe Robert Bell has there for the Fibre event as well. Over the same period with the association, one of our committee members, agronomist Hannah Cummins, worked alongside another long-time member, Dr. Beth Penrose, who was then at UTAS, to put together the next in a series of the 4 annual crop surveys with detailed data collected every year from our state's many licence holders. There were 89 hemp licence holders on the island at last count. And last year, we had 2 more of our very clever board, Becky McLaughlin and Tim Crow, take the lead in putting together a grant application, which snagged us some funding from the state government to run the first ever national campaign promoting hemp as a food. This campaign has very creatively been named Eat Tassie Hemp and will be rolling out over the coming months on both digital platforms and regional TV. In addition to all of this very cool stuff, the 9 elected board members have made valuable contributions to the submission for the current review of our state's hemp legislation. We continue to engage with the government departments who are responsible for all 3, that's right, that's 3 pieces of legislation that mention the plant cannabis, and we're lobbying hard for critical common sense updates to be made to these archaic pieces of legislation. Back in 2020, the THA also invested time and money into the creation of a business case, which has formed the basis of the launch of XHemp, which I will talk about a little more in a minute. I'm really bloody proud of the work that we do at the THA. As a state industry group, we are definitely punching above our weight, and I generally believe that we are making a difference on the critical education component that Gary Rogers was talking about yesterday, which is absolutely essential for building these markets. In the middle of these years of my work with the THA, which turned out to be the same period that I launched XHemp and the same time that I was the event manager for the national conference, I broke ground and began the slightly challenging job of building 2 hempcrete homes on Bruny Island. Bruny is also known as the really tiny island that's off the small island, off the big island at the arse end of the world. So it was a bit of a challenging job logistically. The build occurred during the most expensive and tricky time in the construction industry's modern history, thanks to COVID and a near complete broken model of materials supply. And the project came in a lazy 18 months past schedule and 40% over budget. These luxury villas now serve as a showcase property for the many uses of the amazing crop, and I have utilised hemp wherever possible. Our guests enjoy samples of Tassie-grown hemp hearts, protein powder and oil supplied by Hemp Harvests and Ananda Food. They get to try beautiful bathroom products made by the Margaret River Hemp Company. They can enjoy a tipple from the bar cart with hemp gin that was distilled at the New Norfolk Distillery using locally grown seed supplied by the Tassie Hemp Shop. They can try hemp vodka from the Natural Distilling Company in Victoria, or have a sip of the fabulously named Dead Man's Fingers rum. Many attendees at our hemp events can attest that the rum tastes a lot better than the name suggests, and there's no hint of decomposing digits in that particular beverage. We have hemp linen on the beds and hemp rope on the fence, both of which were sourced in China due to a lack of local manufacture. And we have Tassie grown and processed hemp mulch on the native gardens. Most importantly, folks who book a stay are actually surrounded by the gorgeous thick hempcrete walls, which were the first to be made from herd that was grown and processed in Tasmania, and that was herd that was processed by XHemp. The herd was mixed with the only certified Aussie-made binder on the market, which was supplied by industry guru Clara Marasecki and her incredibly hardworking team at the Australian Hemp Masonry Company. I agree with Gary wholeheartedly that Clara is the reason we currently have even a fledgling hemp building industry here in Australia, and her tireless work and hard-won expertise should be recognised by all of us that are entering the market more recently. The hemp on Bruny was installed by a team which was led by the lovely Will Brain, who flew in from Victoria and lived on Bruny Island over the summer of 2022 to help me get this project over the line and to prevent me from having a complete nervous breakdown. This is the part in the presentation where I tell you all that I'm actually 73, and if it wasn't for the enormous amount of hemp oil that I place on my face every day, I'd be looking a lot more ragged. So that's basically what I've been up to for the last couple of years, which leaves us with the question of how did I end up working in hemp? While my path to get here has been a little professionally unconventional, my motivation and decision to work in this sector is deeply personal and results from 2 major life experiences I had in 2013. On the 4th of January of that year, I lost everything that I owned in the Denali fires on the Tasman Peninsula. And then in September of the same year, I lost my flat in Colorado in the worst flood to hit that region in over 1,000 years. After surviving those 2 traumatic events, I took a couple of years pulling myself together again and thinking deeply about what I wanted my professional legacy to be. As a clue, it doesn't involve the Kardashians. The double header of being hit with the impacts of the 2 natural disasters in the space of 9 months sharply focused my attention on the realities of the climate crisis and exposed me to the vulnerability of how it feels to be made homeless twice. It also led me into a lot of learning around the toxic elements that there are in most of the conventional building materials that we surround ourselves with and build our homes out of. And I started looking into options for fire-resistant and non-toxic construction products and ways that we can build that are less carbon intensive. Like you, all roads led to hemp, and I landed on what I consider the 3 pillars of my working life. I made the decision to dedicate myself professionally to projects that I felt might help with the climate crisis, which is the single greatest threat that humans face, while also working on two big passions of mine, which are affordable housing and supporting women through employment. This confluence of life experience and events led me, in sort of a slumdog millionaire style, to be working in a state that at the time was growing about 80% of the nation's hemp crops, when I was employed by the peak industry body who were looking to put together a business case for fibre processing and simultaneously planning to build with hempcrete. And those are the reasons that I launched XHemp. Our original business model was based on an idea brought to the THA board by Clara from AHMC to find ways to take the grain stubble left over from the seed crops that were being grown under contract and burned as waste, as there was a strong enough market demand for customers locally to be paying huge sums to import hurd either from the mainland or from overseas. Over the decade before XHemp launched, there were roughly 10 homes built, about one a year, and they were nearly all using hurd from the Northern Hemisphere. In the 18 months since we've started running our processor at XHemp, which is a relatively inexpensive model which came from Ashford Hemp Industries and really has been used just to prove our business case and to secure our supply lines, we've tripled the number of hempcrete homes built in the state and are currently on back order for hurd. While I agree with Peter Rigetti, who said yesterday that our current situation in Australia due to supply chain is that we are a cottage industry, I don't think we should shy away from that fact or be too optimistically blue sky when we're sharing our projections with potential investors. It's important that our financial backers are in this for the long haul with realistic expectations and are not looking to make a quick buck. A quick buck. That's a word that you don't want to say incorrectly. I wasn't able to relate as easily to another point Peter made when he reported happily that South Fibre's first harvest, the baling was really, really easy, and that they were popping out 50 lovely fat round bales of about 300 kilo an hour. This has certainly not been our experience here, and all of our harvest seasons have involved a lot of blood, sweat, tears and swearing. So I'm very curious to learn a little bit more about their process. We have very experienced balers working in Tassie who have been in the district for many decades, and about 30 to 40 bales an hour on an easy crop like lucerne is about the maximum. So I'd really love to hear more about the techniques and equipment that got that fantastic result for the fellas up north. As several of the attendees have mentioned, we do have a bast problem, and there's a reason that my team and I call it the bastard bast. In our first season, we had every problem you could possibly think of getting fibre off the paddock, including having no baling contractors locally who were willing to take the risk with their own equipment. And unfortunately for the one who was brave enough to try, those fears did prove to be justified, as we had two instances of his machine catching on fire. So it can be a very tricky crop to harvest, as most of us know. In that first harvest season, the weather set in early. It was one of the earliest and wettest autumns on record, which led to our baler getting bogged in the remaining paddocks. And we had to pull the pin in mid-April and burn off about 2/3 of the perfectly retted hemp so that the farmers could get their winter crops into the ground. It was as I was standing at the side of the paddock, literally weeping, and a lovely grower put his arm around my shoulder and gave me a big hug and said, "Welcome to agriculture, darling," that I knew that I was in for a pretty exciting couple of years. In our second season, we were much luckier with the weather, and the last instruction that I gave to the now 3 baling contractors who were brave enough to work with us in this past year, just before I got COVID, was just keep going until the weather sets in, fellas. We just want to get as much as we can after the experience last year. They took that instruction very literally. And as that happened at the time where I was incredibly unwell with COVID, I had 4 months off with collapsed lungs and a whole bunch of fun things going on there. The boys harvested and harvested and harvested. So we resulted in getting over 600 hectares. We took in over 4,000, mainly round bales. We had 3 balers, so 1 square and 2 round balers. The round bales varied in size quite dramatically depending on the conditions and the operator, but the average was about 200 kilo. And we took 5 of the seed varieties that had been planted for production that year: Excalibur, Finola, CFX, CRS and Catani, with varying rates of success on each of those. I also baled the 2 1-hectare trial crops that we'd planted of the eco-fibre variety MS77 in recognition of the risks of tying my business model to another commodity market. And I think for most of us who know what's going on with the seed for food sector right now, you'll understand why I took that precaution as a bit of risk mitigation. We wrapped our 3rd harvest a few months ago, as we're still working through the massive quantity of raw material from 2022. We decided just to put in a small 17-hectare pivot of MS77 this year, and that was grown by an experienced farmer who's also our landlord and friend, John Hurd at Formosa and Cressy. We lost a third of that paddock to a very massive and unprecedented flood that happened in October. Thanks again, our old mate climate change. However, we still got a pretty decent yield off that variety, and we'll be planting it again this year alongside seed supplied by Midlands. We have purchase orders and have processed materials for 26 homes in Tassie and one in New South Wales, where a last-minute failure by another herd supplier to notify their client that they couldn't get the material there on the date promised left a homeowner sitting with a crew and gear waiting on site with no hemp to install. While Ex-Hemp was happy to do an emergency shipment across Bass Strait so that home could be built, the customer was left with a horrendous freight bill and probably quite a bad taste in their mouth. I cannot stress enough the importance of transparency as we get this industry truly operational. Posting on social media that you are processing a tonne an hour and then sending wet or mouldy herd to job sites or failing to deliver quantities that without adequate notice is hugely harmful to all of us, and it would be great if that could stop. Before I talk very briefly about the motivation to get into the hemp industry, both for myself and others, I do want to acknowledge the role that Phil Warner has played up until this point. I agree with Lynn's assessment yesterday about Phil being considered certainly one of the fathers or the parents of industry, if we're going to be much more diplomatic. And Phil has become a good mate and a source of both logistical and financial support to me and my team at Ex-Hemp over the years. Phil has also been incredibly generous with his consultancy fees as we're a scrappy, underfunded startup. And I think so far it's just cost me one very nice bottle of Lark whiskey. So why are we all doing this? Matt Weir's presentation yesterday, he said that it's never been about the money for him. And I think because this journey has been so incredibly challenging for me, I'd say that I feel the same way. In my opinion, while retaining a commercial perspective and understanding the need for financial viability and getting a return for my investors, I do truly believe that any founder in an early stage industry can't or shouldn't be in this for the money. If your personal driver is simply to make a lot of money, I recommend avoiding our industry at all costs at this stage. A mate of mine who's doing very well for himself in the States said that if you personally want to get rich, you shouldn't work in hemp. And if you want to burn money and have fun, you should buy a boat instead. I think I agree wholeheartedly on both points. At the Australian Industrial Hemp Conference held in 2020 in Western Australia, one of the speakers spoke about this period of industry development as a green rush for hemp, making a comparison to the gold rush industry. And even at the time, with only 6 months industry experience under my belt, which had mainly been writing for Hemp Today magazine as a freelance writer, I can remember thinking, why would we want to compare ourselves with an industry like the gold rush? For me, that evokes an impression of a very small number of people making a huge amount of money, the environment getting trashed, and a lot of people getting badly hurt. So I think there's probably better analogies that we can find to use to describe where we are at the moment. There is nearly overwhelming complexity involved in actually setting up any new startup. And in hemp, it's probably the hardest thing that I've ever done. This is number 4 for me. So the piece of advice that I probably have is you just have to just do it. You've just got to have the stomach and the nerve to just get out there and do it. And honestly, that's probably really the thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people talking and waiting and delaying. As Colin Steady said, then mentioning the missing the window to place your order for your planting seed, another harvest goes unplanted, which is where we're slowing things down. I really agree with the idea of walking the walk, as Colin and Lynn were both talking about yesterday. And while I personally also love hemp clothing and bed linens, my focus on supporting industry in a truly tangible way, albeit small, is buying products that were grown in Australia. That's the reason I've replaced my daily fish oil tablet with a hemp oil supplement. It's much better for the environment as well. I eat hemp seeds daily. I use hemp oil as part of this very, very complicated beauty regime. And I'll continue using hemp biocomposite products, whether they're made through Ex-Hemp or other companies like Hempwood or Hempatecture in the States, in every single property development that I'm involved with going forward. While I'm not much of a purist, and I do believe that any hemp is better than none, I'm trying to avoid the imports that are making it even more difficult for us to grow and compete locally. I source my daily use products from companies who I know are actually putting hemp in the ground under contract in Australia and are making sure that their farmers get paid. So if you are shopping for hemp products, it's worth doing a little due diligence just to make sure that you're dealing with reputable suppliers. I strongly recommend joining your state industry group. The THA is the reason XHemp got started, and by having an active voice at your state level, you also get to participate nationally through the Australian Hemp Council. I really want to encourage everybody to support each other where we can. We should be following each other on socials, we should be amplifying one another's wins and working collectively to educate consumers on what exists in the market and how they can best support our industry's growth. If a customer from WA contacts me at XHemp looking for herd, I put them in touch with Gary and Georgina or Iggy in Western Australia. If someone contacts me from New South Wales, I put them in touch with Clara, obviously as a first point of contact, or Connie and Leon Minos at Ashford Hemp Industries. While I'd like to think that other operators are doing the same, I was told recently that when a customer rang a reasonably well-known hempcrete builder in Victoria and was asked about locally produced hempcrete, he was told there wasn't any available, which I'm sure was just a mistake and nothing to do with the sideline that particular person has importing herd and binder from overseas. XHemp now hosts 3 practical hempcrete installation training days each year, which are run by the Australian Hemp Masonry Company, and will likely add a 4th as interest continues to grow. Clara and I have both seen a real shift in the composition of the attendees at those courses over the past years, with less homeowner builders and more qualified trades. So it's more sort of the experience that Gary talked about yesterday. This is really important because we don't want people just building the one house that's their dream home and then not going on to help us build others. We've also got large corporate members now like Hanson Yuncken, who are a massive commercial building company, who are getting ahead of the pack by adding hemp as a material they can offer their clients, and they'll be sending a large group of their staff to do this training in August. One of the reasons Hanson Yuncken are doing that is part of the contract that Australian Hemp Masonry Company and XHemp have signed with UTAS. The University of Tasmania has made a commitment to include locally grown and processed hemp biocomposite products in all of their future builds, which is an incredibly exciting development. We'll be releasing full details of that project over the coming weeks. And to my knowledge, this will be one of the largest public hempcrete buildings in the world, the first project that kicks off in Hobart. So that's about it for me, really. When Colin and others have talked about the pie of hemp building in Australia or hemp fibre production in Australia, I see a small group of us who are really keen to work together and a very small handful of people whose self-interest is holding us back. We live in a nation with a population of less than 3 of the largest cities in the world. So for me, it feels like we're fighting over the scraps of a pie that hasn't actually yet been baked. I'm extremely interested in hearing more about the cooperative model that Simon spoke about yesterday, and I'll be pestering him in a follow-up call over the next week to speak about ways that XHemp can be involved. I'm excited to stay looped in with the work of the Hemp CRC and also to continue working hard for everyone down here on the island and loudly beating the drum on behalf of all of us who are working in the cannabis industry in Australia.